Last week in Delfino Square, I replaced the old trees with some from Splatoon 3, and also got to some viewer requests. This week, I'll be working on the alleyway some more, and adding a couple little details. I want to fill out the alleyway with some of these building faces, but first, I've got to optimize the white ones a bit. They've currently got 871 triangles each, which is way too many. I tried optimizing these in the past, but couldn't seem to do it. This time, however, I was able to figure some things out. The first thing I did was completely recreate the two windows on the right. I went all Jack the Ripper with the loop cuts, and now we're stuck in a pile of 800 triangles. But I'm gonna fix this. I'll start with this basic square window and try to achieve a similar shape with much less loop cuts this time. And yeah, no bullying this time. And just like that, we've got a much more simple window that doesn't look much different. The other window was even more convoluted, but just as easy to replace. The next thing I can do is recreate some of the faces on these windows that don't need loop cuts. This is simple if you take it slow, and also quite satisfying. I just selected the faces in an area, deleted them, and recreated them with the F key. There were some areas where I had to use the F key between vertices to create new lines that I can then fill with faces. Now that that's all done, we're down to 356 triangles from 871. That's 515 triangles gone. Well, now I suppose I can spend well over an hour copying this face onto every single one of these white buildings, making tiny adjustments to each of them. Maybe, more optimizing to do? Well, there's no way to postpone this. I've got to get this done. So here it is, halfway done. There were a few interesting parts of the process. I decided to put a top on these archways, for example. Once I have a better texture on these and some more faces on these buildings, I can put some cool decorations on top of these. Well, let's at least get the intro section of the alleyway set up, to kinda get a proof of concept on how the rest will look. Setting up the gray building on the corner here was pretty interesting. This ended up being a neat looking building, because it's just got the one door on the corner, while the other two sides are just windows. Now I want to set up some details, like maybe some balconies here. So I copied one over and set the ivy up a little bit. I also put the gray building texture on the floor of them. This is pretty good. But I noticed, unrelated, the UVs on the stone beams on the buildings weren't set up quite right. So I got to fixing them. When one face is just offset in the UV like this, you can move it into place in the UV editor and make sure that the lines that are supposed to connect are about in the same spot. There we go. Well, now that that's done, I've got to find a way to spruce up this alleyway section a bit. Something to sit on the side of the track to add some color and variety. So I copied this flower box here and found a spot for it. Now I can't just set this anywhere. If it's right here, for example, anybody trying to turn this corner tightly might smash into it. So instead, I'll place it here in this corner. Nobody has any business in a corner like this, so anybody slamming into it has only themselves to blame. These should look pretty cool when they're all set up through the alleyway. But what good is a nice looking alleyway when you have to pass a crappy 2007 Pianta statue to get to it? So let's finally get to updating that thing. I started by using a subdivision surface modifier, which didn't quite work. But luckily, there's the edge split modifier. And even more luckily, the edge split modifier isn't permanent before it's applied, so I can undo this. Instead, I'll just manually separate the limbs, which for Piantas includes the nose. Now I can do a subdivision surface modifier separately and reconnect things where I need to. Then I can do a subdivision surface on the rest of him. And don't worry, I'm not keeping this texture. I looked around and found something from Super Bell Subway. I recolored it in Photoshop and threw it on. It's gonna need a little bit of readjusting here and there with the color, but it looks pretty good. Then I made some eyeballs for him out of spheres. Now I don't need these to be super high detail, so I lowered the ring and segment count in the initial creation settings down here in the left. Just keep in mind that if you want to access this vital menu, you need to do so right after you create the shape, because as soon as you click anything, it goes away. I also retextured this fountain thing a little bit. I've said it before in this series, but what really made this look right was making sure to line up the seams of the brick pattern with the edges of the geometry. This is something I didn't really utilize in previous projects, but it really makes things look polished, even when the bricks don't line up from one face to the next. Well, before I wrap things up, I figure I might as well add a little bit of detail to the tree section by adding a couple of leaf piles, something I've been meaning to try for a while now. So I downloaded the leaf pile model from Mario Kart 8. It looked a little bit weird at first. The transparency was acting a lot more like an invisibility cloak. So I switched the render method from blended to dithered. But there's an issue. These are not the leaves that are growing on the trees here, which implies that the local Delfino government imported leaf piles to make their fake trees look more authentic. But these are supposed to be real trees, so let's get that leaf texture on there. This is going to take some messing with UV maps to get this right, but after a while it was looking good enough. I put a bigger one over near the big tree and a slightly smaller pile on the left side of the track. This isn't all I want to do in this area, but it's definitely on the list. Well, that's all for this week. The buildings in that alleyway section are probably going to happen as a sort of background thing over the course of a few parts, but I'm really excited to finally get around to detailing that section. I feel like the track is starting to get to a point that there's a foreseeable resolution, which means the beginning of a new project, but that could be a few weeks out depending on how things go. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed watching. I'll talk to you later. Thanks.